We are all familiar with the popular narrative that the fighting here in Adams County forever changed the trajectory of the Civil War, that the outcome of the war was decided here during 3 days in July. Ken Burns' Civil War series embraces this conception of the war, as he devoted more than 45 minutes to Gettysburg as the turning point of the conflict. State standards of learning often ask, what is the turning point of the Civil War? And the correct answer in every instance is Gettysburg. The Gettysburg campaign looms large in the American mind, especially if one seeks turning points in which all great events hang. Such reasoning, unfortunately, misses how the war was a vast struggle, always in motion, full of contingency, and never determined by simple cause and effect relationships. The halting and uneven steps toward a Northern victory of Union and emancipation occurred as part of a long and complicated process, one that took a life of its own and transformed the Civil War into what Abraham Lincoln said that he did not want, a remorseless revolutionary struggle. Why the war took this radical turn and what made it possible for Lincoln to celebrate in his benediction at Gettysburg that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom compels us to consider the year 1862. When Union armies nearly took Richmond, when Confederate forces raided the border states for the first time, when federal soldiers shifted away from a policy of conciliation, and when emancipation joined Union as a political aim. To help navigate this critical and extraordinarily complex year of 1862, we have as our guides Professors Alan Guelzo and James McPherson. Before we turn to this evening's conversation, let me say a few things about our panelists. Dr. Alan Guelzo is the Henry R. Luce Professor of the Civil War Era at Gettysburg College, where he chairs the Civil War Era Studies Department. He is also the director of the Gettysburg Semester, an intensive semester-long immersion in Civil War studies which draws undergraduates from colleges and universities nationwide. Dr. Guelzo earned his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, Master's of Divinity from the Philadelphia Theological Seminary, and he received an honorary doctorate in history from Lincoln College in Illinois. During the 2010-2011 academic year, Dr. Guelzo served as the William Garwood Visiting Professor of Politics at Princeton University, where he offered courses on American statesmanship and the constitutional questions of the Civil War era. A leading Lincoln scholar, Dr. Guelzo became the first two-time winner of both the Lincoln Prize and the Abraham Lincoln Institute, became the two-time winner of both the Lincoln Prize and the Abraham Lincoln Institute Prize for his books. Those titles, Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. His latest book, Fateful Lightning, A New History of the Civil War and Reconstruction, was just released this year from Oxford University Press. To my immediate left, Dr. James McPherson is the George Henry Davis 86th Professor Emeritus at Princeton University, where he taught Civil War history for nearly 4 decades. He earned his PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 1963, where he studied under the distinguished Southern historian C. Vann Woodward. Professor McPherson is the author or editor of more than 20 books, including his Pulitzer Prize-winning Battle Cry of Freedom, which has sold more than 600,000 copies worldwide. Like Professor Guelzo, he is also a 2-time winner of the Lincoln Prize, which he earned for his 1997 book, For Cause and Comrades, Why Men Fought in the Civil War, and for his 2008 effort, Tried by War, Abraham Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief. In 2000, he was named the Jefferson Lecturer in the Humanities by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and in 2007, he received the first ever Pritzker Prize for Lifetime Achievement in Military History. Most recently, he is the author of War on the Waters, the Union and Confederate Navies, a volume in the University of North Carolina's Press's Littlefield History. Professor McPherson and Professor Guelzo, before we get started, I would like to return to the issue about Abraham Lincoln not wanting this struggle to become a remorseless and revolutionary one. Certainly by the end of 1862, it had become that. I'd like for us to begin our discussion by thinking about the expectations that Americans had, Northern and Southern, free and slave, at the beginning of 1862. What were those expectations, and how did the war challenge them?
Well, I'll start off. Lincoln had made that comment about not wanting the Civil War to become a remorseless revolutionary conflict in his annual message to Congress in December of 1861. There were already signs by then that it might become a remorseless revolutionary conflict, and some of those signs involved the institution of slavery. General Fremont in Missouri had issued a military edict freeing the slaves of Confederate sympathizers in Missouri, where the conflict had already become, or begun to become, quite remorseless because of guerrilla conflict there. Lincoln had to rescind that edict because he was afraid that it would drive the border states, and especially Kentucky, into the hands of the Confederacy. Then his Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, had in his annual report recommended emancipation of slaves in the South and the arming of those slaves to fight for the Union. Lincoln had to suppress that as well. And I think the reason he did so was not only because of the danger of driving the border states into the hands of the Confederacy and also alienating Northern Democrats from his war coalition. He wanted this to be not a Republican war and not an anti-slavery war, but a war for the Union. And he was afraid that these two vital constituencies would bail out from that war. But he was also, at this stage of the war, December 1861, the beginning of 1862, still laboring under I think we would have to say, the misapprehension that a silent majority of people in the Confederacy really had been swept into secession and into this war by the passions of the moment back in 1860 and early 1861. But that if the leaders of the rebellion could be discredited, if the armies of the rebellion could be defeated, then if the federal government pursued a policy of conciliation of the Southern people and of the Southern states, they could be brought back into the Union without this becoming that remorseless revolutionary conflict. So in the early months of 1862, the war was teetering on the edge of a war to restore the Union through defeating the armies of the Confederacy, but then conciliating the people of the South, teetering on the edge of that and something much more radical, a war of subjugation, if you will. But at the beginning of 1862, Lincoln didn't yet want it to become a war of subjugation.
I think also in the context of 1862, what you see Lincoln talking about as a remorseless revolutionary struggle is something that he continues to worry about all through the course of the Civil War. There are ways in which Lincoln will, on the one hand, say to people, well, we have to disenthrall ourselves from the ways that we have done things in the past. We're looking at a new situation. We're looking at a critical situation. We have to be prepared to take some steps we haven't thought about taking before. But he's always trying to balance this because he never wants to see the progress of the war subvert the very reason that the war is being waged, which is to preserve the Union, which is to preserve the Constitution. He's constantly asking the question, is what I am doing something which in fact is going to cause more harm? And he will be always yanking back generals, politicians, advisors who want to step over a certain line. And at the very end, in his second inaugural speech, he will be talking again about how we cannot make this war or its conclusion into something remorseless. He talks about how both sides have come into the war with expectations that neither side has seen justified by the conclusion of it. And what then should we do as a result of that? And he was saying, we should show malice toward none, charity for all. And again, he is trying to keep a lid on this war. Because imagine a civil war in which all bets are off, in which anything is possible as a result. A military coup, a president who seizes for himself extraordinary powers, a Congress which takes actions that set the Constitution aside. All of these things are possibilities. Anything can happen in this kind of crisis situation. And what Lincoln is trying to do is, on the one hand, he wants to apply the maximum military might that will end this war and bring the Confederate States back into the Union. Yet at the same time, he wants to make sure there's still a Union to come back into. And how to do that, walking that line, so much more perilous, so much more difficult in 1862, 63, 64 than I think we often appreciate. It's very easy to look at the results in 1865 and assume that, well, that's all that was at stake. That was all that was going to happen. We could have blown the entire experiment of a constitution, of a democracy. We could have blown that north and south completely to pieces. The country as a whole could have fragmented into so many different ways. And that could have happened. It didn't, and I think a large reason that it didn't happen had to do with exactly Lincoln's skill at balancing the agenda for bringing the war to an end, but still keeping a Union there that is worth celebrating and that can still celebrate the end of the war as one piece.
One of the things I should have mentioned at the beginning is that the process for this evening. We'll have 45 minutes or so to chat amongst ourselves. I'll be sending them easy questions to get them into the flow. I have great respect for my elders up here. In fact, Dr. McPherson was on my dissertation committee. After I get them warmed up for the audience, then you get your crack. And so we have some folks out there from the Pennsylvania Guard who will be taking questions that you can write down. I believe you have cards as well. They will be collecting those questions and they will be delivered to me. And then that will give you all an opportunity, or at least some of you an opportunity, to ask them some things directly. So my role, of course, is to be a facilitator, but it's also to also provoke some opinions as well. And I'm struck, Alan, by your point that Lincoln's job was to keep the lid on it, and that we were on the cusp of being a fragmented nation. And I think you speak very well to the great challenges that Lincoln faced in being able to accomplish that. But can we get on the ground and talk about ordinary folks, Northerners and Southerners, freed and enslaved? Because I guess one could make the argument, very difficult for Lincoln to keep the lid on this thing because the people on the ground wouldn't allow it. So as we start to move into 1862, can you both comment about what's happening either in the military, what's happening on the home front, again, Northern and Southern, that's making it very difficult for Lincoln to keep the lid on it?
Well, let me just make a stab first at the comments about the soldiers. I think the Union soldiers are becoming increasingly disillusioned with the idea of fighting a war against rebels who are trying to kill them, trying to destroy the United States. And at the same time, now that they're in southern states like Virginia and Tennessee, and Louisiana, at the same time protecting the property of these people against whom they are fighting. By the spring and early summer, into the summer of 1862, you get all kinds of letters now from soldiers in the South saying it's time to take off the kid gloves and to crack down on these people. I think that the idea that this silent majority of the Southern whites were somehow bulldozed into secession, into the war, that many people in the North initially, including Lincoln, initially thought, Northerners are changing their minds about that. They see that the Southern people are, Southern whites are more or less united in many parts of the South in support of the Confederacy, and this idea that they can be conciliated back into the Union is going by the board. And many of the Union soldiers writing letters home, writing letters to the newspapers themselves are becoming more and more determined to crack down on these rebels, show them no mercy. And that begins to move in the direction of attacking their property. Not only the plantations, but slavery itself, which is the chief form of property in the South. So you begin to get a movement on the part of the average soldier, many of them, saying it's time to move against these people, take off the kid gloves, take their property, and if necessary, take their slaves as well. That's the only way we're going to put down this rebellion. It becomes a war not merely to restore the Union, but a war to put down the rebellion and to do whatever it takes to put down that rebellion. That attitude is becoming more and more prevalent on the ground, not only among the soldiers, but among their families back home, among newspaper editors, by the spring and summer of 1862.
And it can go in a number of odd directions, too. Union soldiers on the peninsula, in the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, are able to see the Confederate forces that they are opposing using large numbers of black slaves as laborers to dig ditches, to build fortifications, to provide all kinds of support services. And this is what is freeing up white Southerners to take up arms and shoot them. So Union soldiers are saying, why are we treating slave property so delicately when this is being used by the Confederates to make war on us? And at that point they're saying, in very practical terms, this is not terribly productive. We think we should be emancipating those slaves, because every slave that is emancipated is one more productive asset that is subtracted from the Confederacy. So sometimes it's not a terribly idealistic opposition to slavery. Sometimes it's very pragmatic. But they're thinking in terms of how can we weaken the Confederate war effort. Sometimes it is very idealistic. A colonel in one of the Ohio regiments, he was from Cincinnati, his name was Marcus Spiegel, was part of the forces that moved into Kentucky and then into Tennessee. And Spiegel wrote home in a series of letters to his wife, and he said, I always thought that God had made the black man to be a slave. But since I have got down here and seen how slavery really functions, that it's not what the romantic lithographs made it look like. It's not what the Stephen Foster songs made it sound like. That it is a really vicious, inhumane system. Having seen that, now I will not rest until this institution is destroyed. And then there were many people who reacted in exactly the opposite direction. There were people through the North who said, well, not only do we not want the war prosecuted in a very aggressive fashion, but one thing we certainly don't want to find are emancipated slaves, now free, coming north and competing with us for jobs. So even in 1862, as soldiers are drawing one set of conclusions, civilians and politicians at home in the North are drawing another set of conclusions, and you have state legislatures in Indiana and in Illinois which go overwhelmingly anti-administration, and when they do, they are meeting and passing resolutions, as they did in the Illinois legislature, calling for a peace conference to be called to meet at Louisville, Kentucky on the 4th of July, 1863. Of course, there was something else going on that first week in July of 1863, which got in the way of that. Or they are calling for denunciations of the Lincoln administration. They're calling for the withdrawal of Illinois and Indiana troops from the Army. The newly elected governor of New York, Horatio Seymour, in his inaugural address, he's just been elected that fall of 1862. In his inaugural address, it's one unending attack on Lincoln, and Seymour will do everything he can to throw sand into the works of the Lincoln administration, even to the point of refusing to cooperate with the initiatives to recruit black troops for the Union armies. He won't permit New Yorkers to have anything to do with that. So there are people who will react in exactly the opposite direction. And this situation makes for massive political contest, massive political confusion. What are we doing? Where are we going? To the point where by the end of 1862, and as you move into 1863, Horace Greeley called it the darkest time of the war, because it really was. Directions that were opening up in so many unprecedented directions that people did not know what was liable to happen as a long-term result of this.
You've done a really nice job of talking about the soldiers' response and how civilians on the North and the South responded to this, but we still haven't really got on the ground yet and talked about the slaves' response. And so let me read to you a quote from the historian Barbara Fields, and I'd like to have your comment on this remark. In the Ken Burns documentary, Barbara Fields, professor at Columbia History, she said, "The slaves' stubborn actions in pursuit of their faith gradually turned faith into reality. It was they who taught the nation that it must place the abolition of slavery at the head of its agenda." I'll read that last part again. It was they who taught the nation that it must place the abolition of slavery at the head of its agenda. Your thoughts?
Well, Ellen has already made one point about that, and that is perception, the growing perception that the slaves are providing, they make up the majority of the labor force in the Confederacy that keeps the economy going, that supports the Confederate war effort, and thousands of them are being used by the Confederate Army for its fortifications, for its logistics. Without slave labor, the Confederate Army could not have operated, and without slave labor, the Confederate economy could not have functioned. And so that perception is playing a major role here, but I think what Barbara Fields is mainly, the point she's making primarily there, is that from the very first day that Union soldiers penetrated anywhere into the South, slaves started running away from their farms and plantations to Union lines. In May of 1861, 3 of them come into the Union lines at Fortress Monroe in Virginia, where Benjamin Butler is the commander. They have been working on Confederate fortifications across the Hampton Roads in the Norfolk area. They asked basically for asylum in the Union lines. And when the Confederate officer comes and asks Butler to return them, Butler says, no, they are contraband of war, and therefore under the laws of war can be seized. And more and more slaves begin to come into Union lines, thousands of them. And that really, they vote with their feet for freedom. And they force the Union Army and the United States government to decide what they are going to do with these people. In March of 1862, Congress passes a new article of war forbidding officers of the Army of the United States to return any slaves that come into Union lines. And that is starting with Butler's contraband policy, and this policy and a number of other policies adopted by the United States Congress and eventually by the President, as well as the Army. These are moving the Union war effort step by step toward a policy of emancipation. And what Barbara Fields is saying is that it was the slaves themselves who took the initiative to make this a war for freedom by voting with their feet for freedom and coming into Union lines in their thousands. And I think basically she's right about that.
There were actually, when you think about it, there were a lot of cooks stirring the soup of emancipation. Slaves were one part of that. And by subtracting themselves from the Confederacy, and it's curious this way mentioning Benjamin Butler. Benjamin Butler was the kind of person you would not normally associate with a sense of humor. But this was his great moment for improv. because when these three runaway slaves show up at the gates of Fortress Monroe, he takes them in, and when an officer representing their master, as Jim has said, comes the next day to demand their return, well, this officer demands their return under the terms of the fugitive slave law. Oh, Butler says, I thought you people in Virginia had seceded from the Union. You know, in a later age, we would call that chutzpah. And Butler increases the scope of the joke by saying, well, you know, I really can't return these slaves to you. You slaveholders in the South have for decades told us that your slaves were property. Okay, I'm going to take you at your word. These slaves are property, and since property in war can be seized as contraband, I'm seizing these slaves as contraband. How do you like that? Deal with it. And it's funny because it serves this marvelous purpose. The idea that slaves would run away and find shelter with the Union Army or run away through Union lines and somehow turn up in the North was profoundly unsettling to Northern whites. That was something they were afraid of. But by making almost a joke of it, by saying, well, these are contraband of war, suddenly everybody could turn around, pat themselves on the back and say, isn't that funny what General Butler did? Contraband, why didn't we think of that? And that actually smoothed some of the difficulty around accepting the fugitives as refugees. And it was a real stroke of genius, probably the only stroke of genius that Benjamin Butler ever had during the war. But a stroke of genius. But you know, it did create these odd situations, and one of the oddest, above all, is the one that actually saw Abraham Lincoln offer to buy a slave. This happens in the fall of 1862. The colonel of the 22nd Wisconsin Regiment was an ardent abolitionist. He'd just taken his regiment into Kentucky. And at the picket line of his camp, there shows up one day a fugitive slave. His name is Adam. And he's taken into the camp where he gets a job working with the cooks and the other workers there. And the next day, a carriage arrives at the picket line, and out from the carriage steps this enormous 300-pound man, his owner, George Robertson, who also happens to be the retired Chief Justice of the Kentucky Supreme Court. And Robertson, who knows the law quite well, thank you, says to the colonel of the 22nd Wisconsin, I want my slave back. Kentucky is not part of the Confederacy. We've stayed loyal, and we expect our loyalty to be rewarded. And the colonel says, well, let's talk to this slave. And he calls Adam up and says, Adam, are you willing to go with your master? And Adam says, no. And at that point, the colonel says, well, if he's not willing to go, I'm not willing to let him go. At that point, a large number of soldiers have gathered around these people. This particular justice is kind of looking at them thinking, maybe this is a time for one of those prudence over valor moments. And he withdraws, but the next thing that he does is to file suit. He files a federal suit, he files a state suit against the colonel of the 22nd Wisconsin. He wants his slave back, and he's accusing the colonel of seizing his property, and he's pleading under the fugitive slave law. Oh boy. Well, all of this, of course, immediately goes up to Lincoln. And what is Lincoln going to do? The fugitive slave law is legal. Kentucky is part of the Union. He cannot afford to alienate Kentucky. And he's got the Chief Justice, retired Chief Justice of the Kentucky Supreme Court, carrying this case forward. So what does Lincoln do? He writes to George Robertson and he says, I will pay you any sum up to $500 for this slave, for you to quit claim to this slave. What is Lincoln doing? Lincoln is trying to keep a lid on this situation. He's trying to buy out George Robertson because he does not want Robertson taking this case into the courts where, in fact, there's a possibility that the entire initiative for emancipation might be overturned. So rather than see the case get into the courts, Lincoln is going to try to head it off basically by a buyout offer. Now, Robertson refuses the offer. The case goes into the courts. It's not resolved until 1871. At which point Robertson wins his case and gets a decision worth $900 from the colonel of the 22nd Wisconsin. And 2 years later, Congress votes to refund the amount of the judgment. But this gives you a sense of how maddeningly complex the environment was, and how many false steps could be taken, and how many improvisations were being made as people tried to cope with the complexity of slavery and emancipation. It's the 900-pound gorilla in the room, which people don't want to admit. People want to pretend that slavery is not there, but everybody knows that it is.
Let's step back and talk about the military situation. Spring of 1862, a drumbeat of defeat across the Confederacy. For those of us who focus on Gettysburg and believe that it's the great turning point, there's that sense that after July of 1863 that it was an irreversible decline for the South. And it's simply not the case. And it also ignores that in the spring of 1862 that the North was very close to delivering a knockout blow. We have the Mississippi River, which essentially a Union river. It's no longer a Confederate river by June of 1862. We have Union forces that have basically taken all of Tennessee, Memphis, as well as Nashville. And more importantly, we have a federal force that's just 5 miles outside of Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. This military situation will change dramatically thanks to the ascendancy of Robert E. Lee, his counteroffensive outside of Richmond. Can you help us understand the importance of the 7 Days Campaign and how that shifted thinking amongst politicians, policymakers, amongst soldiers?
Well, I'll start with that. You're quite right that the first 5 months, almost 6 months of 1862 were a period of almost uninterrupted success for Union arms. And it looked in May of 1862 as if the war were about to be won. The Union forces, as you said, were within 5 miles of Richmond. Jefferson Davis sent his family to North Carolina. The Confederate Congress adjourned and decamped. The Confederate Secretary of the Treasury prepared the Treasury reserves to be shipped out of Richmond. It looked like Richmond was about to fall, and that might have been the end of the whole thing. But then, with Robert E. Lee's counteroffensive in June and July of 1862, and a counteroffensive in Tennessee and Kentucky in the later summer of 1862, the 7 days brought Union hopes to a crashing halt, seemed to reverse the momentum of the war. And I think it was as a consequence of that, and it was followed by Second Manassas, by the invasion of Kentucky by Confederate armies in the West. Northern morale plunged all the farther because the hopes in May of 1862 had been so high. The expectations had been so high that the war was about to be won. And as a consequence of that reversal of momentum in July and August of 1862, you have Lincoln rethinking the role of slavery, Lincoln rethinking the idea of trying to end this war through a policy of military defeat of Confederate armies, but conciliation of the Southern people and the Southern states to get them come back into the Union without a revolutionary consequences. Lincoln is now rethinking that, and so are many of the Northern people. And the first result of that, I think, was Congress passed the Confiscation Act in July of 1862 that provides for the confiscation of property owned by Confederates, including their slaves. Congress also passes a Militia Act in July of 1862, which provides that the president can actually recruit and organize black troops if he wishes to do so. The war is taking a harder turn as a consequence of these Confederate successes in the summer of 1862. And that harder turn is going to lead toward a policy of emancipation to strike at the heart of the rebellion, as Lincoln calls it, in a conversation with his cabinet members. We want the Army to strike more vigorous blows. The administration must strike at the heart of the rebellion. And Lincoln is now defining slavery as the heart of the rebellion.
The great irony is it's out of Union defeat that emancipation is really born. It takes a decisive turn. Alan, can you talk about it? And I'm using your words, not mine. You referred to George B. McClellan as the boy wonder. Everyone likes to pick on George B. McClellan, but he plays obviously a pivotal role in how this policy plays out. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between McClellan and Lincoln, and how McClellan reflects a very dominant philosophy, not just within the Army, but on the Northern home front as well, when it came to the issue of emancipation?
Oh, I think you can sum up the relationship between McClellan and Lincoln in one word: bad. The two men could scarcely have been different, more different in their backgrounds, and they certainly were very different in their philosophies. And as McClellan was in charge of the Army of the Potomac, his notion of the war and how it should be waged was entirely different from Lincoln's too. And I think a lot of this comes out of the fact that George McClellan had this very MacArthur-esque view of his role, that he somehow, as a soldier, was fully entitled to dabble in public policy making, fully as much as any of his civilian employers. And to George McClellan, the idea that you were going to attach emancipation to the course of the war was unthinkable. This was going to turn the war into exactly that kind of revolutionary, remorseless struggle that was supposed to be avoided. In fact, McClellan suspected that Lincoln really wanted a revolutionary, remorseless struggle. And George McClellan will be perfectly happy to open back-channel negotiations with Confederate leaders. He will talk, or at least tolerate, the senior generals of his army. He will tolerate them talking about the possibility of turning and performing some kind of military intervention. Not in Richmond, but in Washington. I think that we are only just coming to appreciate now how far George McClellan was willing to go to prevent emancipation from becoming a reality. Because McClellan had convinced himself that the real threat to the United States was not really coming from the rebels. The real threat was coming from these wild-eyed, frizzy-haired abolitionist radicals who had taken opportunity of the war to seize control of the government and were now trying to turn it into this nightmarish scenario. And the only person who was in a position to save the country, North and South, was George Brinton McClellan. And the further that Lincoln pressed in the direction of emancipation, the more McClellan became convinced that he had been anointed to keep this from happening. When, at the conclusion of the 7 days' battles, Lincoln comes down to Harrison's Landing, where the army has been backed up, Lincoln, even before Lincoln gets off the steamer that has brought him there, McClellan bounds up the gangplank and presents him with a letter. Now, mind you, this is the McClellan who has lost battle after battle in succession over the past week or so. You would not think he would have a whole lot of leverage at that point, that maybe he would be going aboard cap in hand instead of letter in hand. But no, he's George McClellan. McClellan presents him with this letter in which he tells Lincoln, his commander-in-chief, that from this point on we have to recognize that this rebellion is not really a rebellion anymore. It's a war between two independent nations. And it needs to be conducted like that. It needs to be conducted on the highest principles of Christian civilization. And among those principles, respect for property is supreme. Therefore, if there is any move towards emancipation, that will dissolve the Union armies. As though George McClellan, as their general, had no responsibility for holding them together. This is a threat. This is the general commanding the Army of the Potomac who is threatening the president that if you don't pull back and if you don't wage this war the way I think it should be waged, there will be consequences. And when you translate it into those terms, you suddenly realize that A, George McClellan had an extremely high opinion of himself, and secondly, that he had an army behind him, an army that adored him, officers whom he'd handpicked and put in position. This man was a threat. And if he had his way, if he had his opportunity to be the peacemaker who was going to reconcile the North and the South on his terms, then he might just take the entire nation down the road toward dictatorship. And why not? He was George McClellan, and he knew better than anybody else. And I think that McClellan at that point, inadvertently, he thinks he's going to scare Lincoln off from emancipation. Lincoln was not the sort of person that you tried to scare, because Lincoln puts the letter in his pocket. When he goes back to Washington, Gideon Welles, his Secretary of the Navy, said that the visit to Harrison's Landing did something to Lincoln. Oh, it did it all right. Because as soon as Lincoln gets back to Washington, one of the first things he's going to say on policy issues to two of his cabinet secretaries is, the time has come to move towards emancipation. God has decided this issue in favor of the slaves. George McClellan, take your attitude, jam it up your nose.
But let's not forget that after Second Manassas, Abraham Lincoln is back to George McClellan.
Oh, yes.
And let's not forget that, in fact, more than 50% of Northerners are Democrat. That perspective, that philosophy is represented by McClellan. So, Lincoln's coming out of your conversations here pretty squeaky clean. Let's think about this for a moment, that Lincoln was a political animal. He was very conscious and aware of marshaling support for the war. Now, I know today that we hear all the time, because of the 24-hour news cycle, that it's the worst time of everything. You know, you can pick your topic, but it's usually politics, right? There's more acrimony now than what we've ever seen. Well, if you have a sense of history that extends to last Tuesday, maybe you can reach that conclusion, right? But for most of us who have a long sense of history, we recognize that these partisan battles have been extraordinarily ugly and intense. And of course, during this time, they were particularly vicious. Now, let's talk about Lincoln here. One can make the case that this man squandered the lives of a lot of Northern soldiers for political generals who were Republicans. This is a man who also admitted that he was controlled by events and at times did not take decisive action in favor of emancipation. And so he was always responding and reacting, often, of course, to solidify his own political base. How do you both respond to what I think is a charge that does have some merit to it?
You want to fight about this, Carmichael?
I do, actually. And I'm a native of Indiana, I might add.
Well, I think that, that Lincoln certainly is a marvelously well-attuned politician. And he was someone who always is going to be sure that he knows where he's putting his foot down, politically speaking. But at the same time, he's not just a cringing pragmatist. He had been thinking about emancipation almost from the very beginning of his administration. I mean, people often say to me, well, why did Lincoln wait so long to emancipate the slaves? Why didn't he emancipate the slaves right after Fort Sumter? Well, the answer is he was, in fact, already toying with ideas like that. And they surface as early as November of 1861, when he has confected this plan for a buyout, federal buyout, of the slaves of Delaware, one of the 4 slave states which remained in the Union. He was already thinking in terms of how can I move things forward so that we can talk about emancipation, and yet talk about it without arousing a political firestorm. And the buyout, the purpose of the buyout was to persuade the Delaware legislature to do the deed. The buyout would provide the Delaware legislature with funding, and the Delaware legislature would abolish slavery within the boundaries of that state. And then nobody could point a finger at Lincoln, because it was the Delaware legislature that did it. That was very symptomatic of the way Lincoln liked to move. So his notion of what to do with slavery was actually already operative. in 1861. It's not that he wakes up late in 1862 and says, well, I think I'll free the slaves because I don't like George McClellan. He's been wondering about how to do this for some time, and he's been trying a variety of mechanisms for some time. For Lincoln, when he deals with McClellan, he deals with him in a very gingerly fashion, because McClellan does have the army with him. He doesn't, for instance, at the end of the 7 Days campaign, he doesn't fire McClellan. He doesn't remove him from command of the Army of the Potomac. What he does is he creates this second army in Northern Virginia called the Army of Virginia and puts John Pope in charge of it, and then begins subtracting elements of the Army of the Potomac, bringing them up and adding them to Pope's Army of Virginia. So after a while, George McClellan, who is still in charge of the Army of the Potomac, finds out that the Army of the Potomac is about 72 men who are his headquarters guard. But then, Peter, as you say, then comes Second Manassas. I mean, the one great problem about General Pope was he just couldn't win the battles. And at that point, the army is demoralized, the troops are demoralized, Lee is knocking on the door of Washington. And what is Lincoln to do? He eats humble pie. He asks McClellan to take charge of the defenses of Washington, take charge of the troops, sort them out. His cabinet is aghast. They had actually prepared a petition asking for McClellan to be court-martialed. And Lincoln comes in and says, well, I've restored him to command. Ooh, that was a long day in politics. But he does this because McClellan is the only one who has the army with him, as he says. And McClellan, who is always eager to see himself as the savior of the situation, sees this as his opportunity to once again get on the front of the stage, reorganizes the army, takes it into the Maryland campaign in the fall of 1862, takes the army all the way to Antietam, and then the great battle takes place there at Sharpsburg on September 17th, 1862. Lincoln's role in this is very adroit. He is a man of practicality, not pragmatism, but he's a man of practical politics who is always working with his practical politics in tandem with his principles. And he's one of those rare political figures who's able to do both. It's a much more difficult, intensely difficult balancing act in politics to do. He is one of the few people who really proves to be capable of doing that.
To pick up on what you've both said, to pick up on the Delaware thing, the Delaware legislature refuses to pass the legislation. Later on, in March of 1862, Lincoln gets the United States Congress to adopt a resolution offering federal compensation to any of the border states that would adopt emancipation, gradual emancipation. Lincoln devotes a lot of political capital to trying to persuade the congressmen and other political leaders in Kentucky and in Missouri and Maryland and Delaware to accept this offer from the Congress to buy out their slaves. They turn him down. And the very day or the next day after they turn him down, I think Lincoln makes the decision, well, if the border states aren't going to cooperate with me, I'm going to move against slavery on my own and declare that it's not going to be in the border states, it's going to be in the Confederate states. And it's just a couple of weeks after that when he announces to his cabinet on July 22nd that he has made a decision to use his power as commander-in-chief to seize enemy property. This is the contraband policy being used to wage war against the United States. This enemy property is the slaves that are providing the labor for the Confederate war effort, to declare their emancipation in states that are at war with the United States. Montgomery Blair, one of his cabinet members, says this is a politically suicidal act. The Democrats will capitalize on it. Montgomery Blair comes out of originally a Democratic family. His father had been a chief supporter of Andrew Jackson a generation earlier. But they had helped to found the Republican Party, the Blair family. But they were in the conservative wing of it, and they still had their fingers on the pulse of the Democratic Party in the North. Montgomery Blair warns Lincoln that this is going to be political suicide. And Lincoln said, well, we're going to go ahead and do it anyhow, because the Democrats would use their clubs against us no matter what we did. So I think that Lincoln has made the decision to proceed on this policy of emancipation, despite the potentially harmful political consequences for his own party and his own administration.
And his party does take a beating.
They do take a beating in the congressional elections of 1862. They do retain control of the House of Representatives, but they lose their overwhelming majority.
So let's go, and the Gettysburg College Guard, I can't see you, but I assume you're out there. If you could collect any of the cards for questions and bring those up, that would be fantastic. Let me go ahead, though, and let's talk about the Emancipation Proclamation that follows in the wake of the victory at Antietam. And it is not certainly an overwhelming victory or a decisive victory for the Army of the Potomac, but Lee's Army in Northern Virginia had to retreat across the Potomac and return to Virginia. And with that, Lincoln was able to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It is a document that is extraordinarily, I think, controversial today amongst historians and especially amongst popular audiences. So let me frame the debate and then you guys can weigh in. There are many people who suggest that the document, in fact, did not free a single slave. That it, in fact, did not fundamentally change the war. While there are others that, of course, that see this document as a revolutionary or a radical one. Help us understand how we can reach such radically different positions and, of course, where you stand on this issue as well.
Well, the historians who say that it didn't have any effect might also say that that declaration signed on July 4th, 1776 didn't do a thing to create American independence. It required the victory in the war to create American independence. Yet the Declaration of Independence became the great symbol, the great statement, the great assertion of American determination to become an independent nation in 1776. And I think the Emancipation Proclamation, and really we need to extend the discussion here to the final proclamation that was issued on January 1st, 1863, because what Lincoln issued on September 22nd, 150th anniversary is tomorrow, was an ultimatum, basically, a warning proclamation that if the states did not come back to the Union by January 1st, then he would use his powers as commander-in-chief to, in effect, confiscate their slave property, and it would be forever free. This is a powerful statement now of the change in the nature of the war. It's no longer a war to restore the old Union, to bring the southern states back into the Union without any fundamental changes in the nature of the relationship, slavery and the relationship between the states and the nation. Now it has become a war to overthrow slavery, to basically destroy the planter class, and to change the nature of Southern society. That proclamation of September 22nd did not free any slaves. The proclamation of January 1st really did. There were lots of slaves in Confederate states that were not exempted from the provisions of the Constitution, of the Emancipation Proclamation, that celebrated their freedom as dating from January 1st, 1863. But it stated an expansion of the Northern war aims. No longer was this going to be a war to restore the status quo antebellum, that is, before the Southern states seceded. Now it was going to be a war to give the nation that new birth of freedom. And that's a really powerful statement and a powerful declaration of expanded and revolutionary war aims.
I think that captures especially how white Americans, white Northerners would have viewed this. Confederates, of course, saw this as a revolutionary document. But some of the words that you used, especially new birth of freedom and forever free, does that accurately capture what the slaves or the enslaved people thought at that moment? did this document have that kind of impact on their lives, and how we historically remember this moment as this great triumph of freedom? Is that what really happened on the ground?
Well, I think
And just a moment, if I could get the questions from,
Sure.
that would be fantastic. Just come on up.
Well, I think if you listen to what the slaves themselves have to say on the subject, then the answer is going to be yes. If you look at slave memoirs, they will speak about the significance of the Emancipation Proclamation. If you look at the testimony of slaves who were interviewed before the Joint Committee of Congress on Reconstruction, they say over and over and over again, I was made free by the President's Emancipation Proclamation. That's the consistent testimony. People today look at the proclamation and they raise this particular question. Well, did it really free anybody? I mean, after all, the slaves whom the document purports to free were part of the Confederacy. Well, Lincoln's word wasn't being taken by anybody down that way. Whereas slaves in places like Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, states that had stayed in the Union, proclamation doesn't touch them, doesn't free them at all. And doesn't that create a really contradictory situation where the slaves that Lincoln does have the power to free, he doesn't free, whereas the slaves he no longer has any power over because they're now the Confederacy, well, those he says he's going to free. Doesn't that show that this is really just a kind of political flim-flam? That this is just a rhetorical gesture that Lincoln is making to try to gussy up the Union war effort and make it look like it's some kind of moral crusade. That's the case that's often made. And I think there's a number of fundamental mistakes about that. First of all, think in terms of what Jim was saying about the Declaration of Independence. Sure, it's signed on the 4th of July, 1776. I doubt whether King George III thought much of it. That didn't mean, though, that it didn't have effect. What's more, just because a law is put in place and enforcement of that law is lagging somewhere behind it doesn't mean that it's not a law. And if you don't think that, just here's an experiment. Go up in the turnpike and do 90 miles an hour, okay, for as long as you possibly can. While you're doing that, 90 miles an hour, for as long as you're doing it, you can say to yourself, there is no such thing as a speed limit in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Okay? And it'll feel that way, too. That is until the people with the funny hats and the revolving lights intercept you. And at that point, enforcement will have caught up with the law. And you find out to your sorrow that the law really does have some meaning. Well, the same thing is true about the proclamation. Enforcement would have to catch up with the proclamation. Enforcement in the terms of the Union armies. That doesn't mean that the proclamation doesn't have real force. People saw that, soldiers saw that, slaves saw that. They perceived very clearly that what Lincoln had done was, at one legal stroke, ended their enslavement and transformed them, at that same stroke, into free individuals.
But that status was very ambiguous. I mean, their status in terms of their political rights,
Oh, that's
still
true.
not defined. Their
That's
economic
true.
rights, still not defined. Their move into contraband camps was a very precarious situation. If there weren't Union armies present, then this emancipation has almost no effect as well, which you've already
Well,
alluded
that's like saying the
you've already
law
alluded
doesn't
to.
have any standing unless the police are there.
Right,
Well, of
but-
course the police
right,
are there.
but I think that the point here is not to suggest that the emancipation had a limited effect. It's to try to get on the ground and see it from the perspective of the enslaved, which is the point is that it's a confusing moment for them. And it's very difficult to even determine that an army with blue suits is going to necessarily be their allies, because experiences in contraband camps could be rather exploitive. But I think the bottom line here is that the Emancipation Proclamation overlooks a great deal. Not that Lincoln should have addressed it at that moment, but that these are fundamental issues that remain unresolved well into Reconstruction. And again, I'm not criticizing Lincoln for not looking ahead. It certainly was beyond, I think, what the Emancipation Proclamation, what Lincoln had any intention to use it for. And that really leads us to our first question from the audience. This is for both of you. While the public touts the Emancipation Proclamation as one of Lincoln's greatest executive orders, the Proclamation is not a beautifully written document compared to the Gettysburg Address or his first or second inaugural address. Explain how Lincoln's strict constitutional strict constitutional limitations make the document valid.
You've written about this, so go ahead.
Yeah, but I can only vouch for the pictures. This is one of the moments when you say, could you rephrase that question?
I can't. It's on the card.
When we're talking about Lincoln's language here, we know that Lincoln is a great master of language. Self-taught as he was, with almost the bare minimum of what we regard as formal education, yet he's a master of words. And we recognize that here, especially at Gettysburg. So it does pose this interesting question. How can the man who wrote the Gettysburg Address 77 years ago, or who wrote the first inaugural with the mystic chords of memory, or the second inaugural with charity for all and malice toward none, how could he then, when he sits down to write the Emancipation Proclamation, write a document which starts off saying, whereas on the 22nd day of September, in the year of our Lord, 1860, and it goes on and on like that, like it was a lawyer writing 10 cents per word. People look at that and they say, this something not right here. Something not right here. That must mean that Lincoln was really half-hearted about it. And that is what led in 1948 the American historian Richard Hofstadter to say that the Emancipation Proclamation has all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading. Yeah, it does. It does, but there's a reason for that. Because the Gettysburg Address and the first inaugural and the second inaugural, they're all beautiful pieces of prose. But you can't take them into a court of law. They're not legal documents. They don't do anything to people. The Gettysburg Address didn't do anything, apart from dedicate a cemetery. It's great prose, but it's not the kind of language that makes something happen in terms of legal relationships. But the Emancipation Proclamation is. The reason why it sometimes reads as dull and legalistic as it is because it is a legal document. It's got work to do. Lincoln cannot afford to indulge flights of rhetoric, even the most gorgeous ones. He has to confect a document which is absolutely well-armored and proof against any potential legal challenge. And that means that it is going to come out sounding heavy-footed and very legalistic. But if he hadn't made it as sure and proof and as legalistic as it was, then he actually would have been in dereliction of his own duty. He would have been rendering emancipation vulnerable. And his aim is to make the proclamation as airtight from legal challenge as possible. He does that at the expense of rhetoric. He does it at the expense of beauty of language. But he had a far more important goal in mind. And as for a bill of lading, I don't know, but actually a bill of lading is a very important document in 19th century commerce. It's the document that itemizes everything that is in a particular cargo. It's what's telling you the value of things, and it's an extremely important document for merchants and for people who are doing business. So I think it's safe to say, yes, the proclamation does have the moral grandeur of a bill of lading because it has the future of 3 million people within it. 3 million people who are bound on a journey toward the land of freedom. I think that's worth a bill of lading.
Let me read you one sentence. This is the conclusion of the final Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, after all of this legal language, as Ellen has mentioned, that makes it armored against legal challenge. Lincoln does then move into the kind of eloquence that you may want to hear. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. So he can go into flights of rhetoric to to make this something beyond just a bill of lading, as he did there at the conclusion of the final Emancipation Proclamation.
Quick and easy question. Ready? How old was Lincoln when he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation?
Old enough.
He's 53 years old.
There you go. All right. This is for both of you. I have heard people say the Civil War was a needless waste. Slavery was already on the road to extinction. Is that true?
No.
No.
All right, next question. We can rip through these.
Next
We
question.
got a big stack here.
Well, slavery, there's no way of knowing how long slavery would have lasted without the Civil War, but the cotton economy was at an all-time level of prosperity in the late 1850s. Slave prices were higher than ever. Cotton prices were if cotton was fetching a good price. Cotton as an article in international trade played the same role in the economy of the middle of the 19th century as oil does today. And the United States South was the source of 3/4 of the world's trade in cotton. So, and slaves grew 90% of the cotton in the American South. So slavery was never more economically viable than it was on the eve of the Civil War. And there was no sign anywhere on the horizon that slavery was likely to disappear anytime soon.
And a
without the
flexible
war.
institution, we should add, that it
Oh,
was
yeah.
being adapted in factories and mines and railroads. I mean, extraordinary. I don't think it would have ended before Brazil or Cuba. It would have lasted well through the 19th century.
I think so,
suspect.
yeah.
Well through the 19th
When you do the numbers on cotton, for instance, and cotton really is the white gold of the transatlantic economy in the 19th century. When you do the numbers, you see these dramatic things. 57% of all American exports before 1860 were one commodity, cotton. Cotton was the big moneymaker for the American economy. Not only that, but if you looked at the way various commodities are being sold across the Atlantic, about 5% of American grain is being grown for export at that point, whereas 95% of American cotton is being grown for export purposes. And it reaped tremendous fortunes for cotton growers. When you think of it like this, imagine 2/3 of every American estate worth more than $100,000 in the 1850s, 2/3 of them were in the South. The richest county per capita in the United States was not Westchester County, New York, or Shaker Heights, Cleveland, or Grosse Pointe Woods, Detroit. It was Adams County, Mississippi. And that is indicative of the extraordinary wealth that cotton represented. Cotton was a great moneymaker, and to be involved in slave owning and cotton growing was synonymous with great wealth. And Peter is absolutely right. Not only cotton, because there's no rule. I mean, we often in our minds associate slavery and cotton agriculture. But there's nothing written in stone anywhere that says that slave labor can only grow cotton. In the border states, in the Upper South, slaves grew wheat, tobacco, a number of other agricultural commodities. But even more ominous, slaves were moving into industrial production, industrial labor. Because after all, one great advantage of having a slave labor force in a factory was that the slaves were never going to go on strike. So instead of slavery being looked upon as a dying institution, the South was actually giving it a new lease on life. And on the very verge of the Civil War, in the Southern Literary Messenger, William Holcomb writes a long article speaking about how slavery is the labor system of the future. That wage labor, as it's practiced in the North, that is just a temporary phase. That the real future economically for America is going to be slave labor everywhere, doing everything.
And I think Alan makes a superb point because it also underscores how Americans, including Southerners, looked across the pond, and what they saw, of course, was tremendous labor unrest. So to conclude that dependent labor or slave labor would be the wave of the future is not an unreasonable conclusion to make. We also should note that the Southern economy, I believe, was the 4th richest in the world in 1860.
If we took the Confederate States purely as a separate economic entity, they would be the 4th largest economy in the world in 1860. In fact, if the Confederacy had, for instance, levied just a 5% export tax on the cotton that it was exporting abroad, it would have raised something in the area of $100 million in revenue, which would have been infinitely more than the United States' own annual expenditures, the government expenditures. It would have made the Confederacy unstoppable, not only as an economic power, but as a political and military power as well.
2 more questions. The first, this is veers away from emancipation. Do you think that military history is overrepresented in Park Service interpretation? How so?
Well, it was a war.
Well, I think I know where that question is coming from. The Park Service made a commitment a dozen years or so ago in its Civil War parks and other historical parks, but specifically in Civil War parks, to try to put the particular battle that that park represented into a broader context of the social and political issues of the war, the context of what that war was about. The issue of slavery, of course, figures largely in that. And Gettysburg National Military Park has been a leader in that. And of course, you can see that, as I'm sure many of you out there have done, when you go to the new visitor center. Not so new anymore, since it's just had its 4th birthday. But I think in the past, one could make the case that military history is overrepresented because the Civil War was about more than just the armies fighting with each other. What we've been talking about this evening was a major theme in the Civil War, and that's now getting more attention in the parks, and especially here at Gettysburg, and I think that's all to the good.
I think that when we talk about the Civil War, it's important to understand a 360-degree view. Yes, this was a war. Military history is important, but it's also a political war. It's a political war between factions that are jockeying for control of the United States government and the direction of policy. It is a political war in which generals in the armies are making military decisions in large part motivated by political considerations. McClellan, of course, is probably the most dramatic example, but he's far from being the only one. And that's not true just of the northern armies either. The southern armies are seriously riven by political dissension. So politics enters into the way the military aspect of the war functions, and vice versa. And then there's the role that the slaves play. There is the role that civilians play. And sometimes the civilians are acting in tandem with the military, sometimes the civilians are acting politically. Yet another aspect of the Civil War, which has to be brought into play here, is the legal and constitutional aspect, because the war is also being fought in the courts. There are questions about the constitutionality of certain actions that are taken by the government. There are protests against the draft, for instance, in 1863. Maybe one of the most dramatic of these confrontations can be illustrated in a case that was known before the Supreme Court as prize cases. Prize cases was really a case about 4 separate vessels whose owners brought suit in federal court because the vessels and their cargoes had been seized by the federal blockade in May of 1861. Now, the owners of the cargoes and the ships protested, and they said, well, a blockade in May of 1861 was not legal because only Congress has the authority to impose a blockade, and Congress hadn't come into special session until July. The blockade was there because Lincoln issued a proclamation. Well, that's unconstitutional, therefore the seizures of our cargoes are unconstitutional, and maybe the blockade itself is unconstitutional because blockade is only supposed to exist in legal terms between two independent sovereign nations. And the Lincoln administration has all along insisted that the Confederacy is not a sovereign independent nation, it's a rebellion. Is that confusing enough in legal terms? All right, this goes into the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court hands down a final ruling on this in March of 1863 in prize cases, in which the Supreme Court does what Supreme Courts often do, and that is tries to have it both ways. Basically, the decision in prize cases says, well, yeah, the Confederacy is only a rebellion, but the blockade is constitutional. That decision was supported by a 5-4 vote. Change one vote on the Supreme Court, and the Union blockade of the Confederacy falls to the ground legally. It opens a Pandora's box of legal actions, and not only legal actions for ships and cargoes owned by American citizens, but what about all the vessels and cargoes belonging to other nations which have been seized by the blockade? What are they going to do in terms of that now that it seems that the blockade would be an unconstitutional and illegal act of seizure? The consequences flowing downstream from that would simply be incalculable. It's not a battle. It's not part of what we would think of as military history. And yet the war could have been lost on one vote on the Supreme Court in that issue. So it is important, I think, as critical as the military aspect of the war is, it was a war. But as critical as that aspect is, we've got to see it in this 360 context, in which we see that the Civil War is a contest not only between two armies, but it's also a contest between political ideas, it's a contest between constitutional ideas, it's a contest on so many different levels, which I think is one of the great things that makes the Civil War such an interesting topic, such a subject that never really wears out.
You made a great case for a national park devoted to the blockade. Let's say Bermuda or something like that. All of our Park Service people would be going there.
I have toyed with the idea of a field trip to Bermuda.
Alan, your point's very well taken, though, about politics, and I think we should remind ourselves that the tremendous changes that have occurred here at the Gettysburg Museum, I mean, there truly are, they're unbelievable. I think the visitor gets a very complex story now that they didn't get before. But we need to remind ourselves that our battlefields are still very much commemorative landscapes. Cannon have become jungle gyms for our kids, or the centerpiece of a family portrait. The monuments continue to shape our historical gaze toward honor and duty, and they, in the process, depoliticize our landscapes. I think the next frontier is actually interpretive markers next to our monuments. Our visitors need a facilitator out there to understand not just the politics of the war, but to also understand the politics of creating monuments. And so that leads us to our final question. It's mine. I'd like for you to comment on criticism that Ed Ayers, noted Southern historian, president of the University of Richmond. It's a criticism of how Americans continue to place emancipation and union side by side. Ayers writes, anti-slavery, progress, war, and national identity intertwined at the time of the Civil War so that each element became inseparable from the others. The story has become common sense to Americans. Emancipation, war, nation, and progress all seem part of one story, the same story. What's Ayers' problem here, and do you agree?
Well, I'll say that I think they all are part of one story, and that I disagree with Ed Ayers if he is challenging that construction of the story. The Civil War was about whether the United States would be preserved as one nation, indivisible. The reason that the war had started in the first place was because the southern states had seceded in defense of slavery. And basically launched a war to perpetuate slavery. The Union side eventually came to the point of saying that in order to win this war, we're going to have to end slavery, or at least attack slavery. The result of the Civil War was to preserve the nation and to abolish slavery. And I personally think that this represented progress, as well as freedom and nationalism. So I see nothing wrong with that coalescence of ideas and themes associated with the American Civil War.
Okay, Alan?
And I'll simply take the point of view that says, I think you're absolutely right. We sometimes separate out the war for the Union and the war to end slavery as though they were two separate wars, as though somehow the Civil War began as the war for the Union and then gradually morphed into becoming the war against slavery. Perhaps as though we think that the first year and a half of the Civil War was a kind of adolescence, and we needed to grow up and grow out of this idea that the war was for the Union into the more mature environment where we say, well, it was the war against slavery. But I think from the very start of the war, it was really about both. And everybody knew it was about both. Lincoln, in his second inaugural, began by reflecting back 4 years earlier to 1861, and he said, back then, 4 years before, everybody knew that slavery was the great interest that was causing people to clamor for the breakup of the Union. People wanted to break up the Union for the sake of protecting slavery. People would end slavery for the sake of protecting the Union. And in Lincoln's mind, the two are really not separate. They're wedded together because unless you saved the Union, you weren't going to be able to do anything about slavery. If the Union was sundered, if the American Union was broken in half and the Confederacy succeeded in its bid to become an independent nation, you weren't going to be able to do anything about slavery there anyhow. So unless there was reunion, there wasn't going to be any possibility of touching slavery. So union has to be there. But in Lincoln's mind also, there was no point in restoring the Union if all you were doing was going back and putting slavery right where it had been before. Lincoln understood that his election marked a dramatic turning point in the political future of slavery, because for the first time in 6 decades, an avowedly anti-slavery president had been elected without a single electoral vote from the slave states. That was the handwriting on the wall, that the slave states no longer were going to be the tail that wagged the political dog. That, of course, is why they seceded. They could read the handwriting just as clearly as anyone else, and they decided to get out while the getting was good, or at least to try. Lincoln's understanding that he puts into his great Cooper Union speech in February of 1860, his understanding of the Constitution was that the founders of the Constitution, the founders of the Republic, had always expected that slavery was going to become extinct on its own. They tolerated it at the founding because it was there, but with the understanding that it was going to go away. It was never supposed to be part of this American experiment in liberty. And the fact that it had grown up, contrary to every one of those expectations, made, Lincoln said in 1854, it made slavery the one retrograde institution that was embarrassing American democracy, that was turning the promise of American democracy upside down and negating it, and making the American democracy a laughingstock in the eyes of every aristocracy in Europe. You restore the Union, but you want to restore the Union to what it was intended to be at its very beginning, which is a Union without slavery. So when you're restoring the Union, you are striking the death blow of slavery right there. The two are like the double helix of DNA. You will not get the one without the other. If you restore the Union, then you can strike at slavery. But if you're going to restore the Union, let it be a union without slavery. Let it be a union who, as Lincoln said, whose Republican robe was cleansed from the soiling of slavery, and which is now unambiguously committed to freedom. That was the struggle that he believed the Civil War was about. And I think that is an important struggle. My goodness, the cost we paid for it was enormous. 720,000 lives. And the calculations continue to shift because it's so hard to keep track of the numbers. All those lives, you shake your head and you think, was it worth it? But remember where we were in 1860. In 1860, the United States was the one large-scale, functioning, surviving democracy in the world. All the other experiments in democracy had gone by the way. The French Revolution, the revolutions in 1820 and 1848, aristocracy was on a roll. The idea that some people were born, booted and spurred to ride other people, that was the idea that seemed to be in the ascendant. And we were the last holdout. And Lincoln knew that if we botched it now by blowing our own political brains out by secession, that would be the end of democracy right there. Because no one would ever take democracy seriously afterwards. Lincoln understood that what we were fighting for, and he said this in these terms, he said, this is a people's contest to determine whether a democracy can really work. That's what he said at Gettysburg. He says, this war, this Civil War, this is a test of whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. That's what the lives were about, and that was why those dead had not died in vain, because they were not just fighting about the boundaries, they were not just fighting about political reunion. In fact, they were even fighting about something that was even more important than the issue of slavery. And that was the very notion of democracy, the workability of democracy, the idea that ordinary human beings can govern their own affairs by themselves without somebody telling them how to do it. That was the great achievement. That was the great thing at stake in the war. The Union survived and slavery went down because democracy was right. And we have been living with the promise of that and struggling to take that promise forward ever since.
Can you all join me, please? Thank you, Professor McPherson and Guelzo.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming.